Hello and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations with Heman. And today we have an extraordinary guest with us, someone whose work has not only shaped the discourse around human rights, but also about the marginalized communities, including Dalits. And she has also brought hope to millions of marginalized voices across the globe. Joining us today is the Dr. Corinne Lennox. She is a reader in human rights, University of London, and a co-director of Human Rights Consortium. She is also a vice chair at the Dalit Solidarity Network, United Kingdom, and with a decades of experience working with the organizations like Minority Rights Group International, Dr. Lennox has dedicated her life to understanding, securing human rights for those who are often left. Her research spans from caste-based discrimination to civil society mobilization in her intersection of human rights and development. She's also author of a groundbreaking works like Translational Social Mobilization and Minority Rights, and she has also co-designed human rights education programs that are empowering the next generation of activists. Today, I'm glad that we are diving deep into her journey, her insights on minority rights and activism on Dalit rights in South Asia and the global fight for equality. So let's get started, Dr. Lennox. I hope you are doing well, and thank you very much for being with us here today. Dr. Lennox, while researching about your work on human rights, you also, our audience will be aware of that your human rights works span decades from working with the UN to co-designing human rights education program. But our audience will be curious on what was on that movement in your life that made you realize that this is my calling and this is what I meant to do. Was there any specific incident or a movement or a person that ignited this fire in you to fight for the rights of minorities and indigenous communities? I would like to give an instance in your book that Transactional Social Mobilization and Minority Rights. You talk about how grassroots movements can reshape global norms. Was there any grassroots movement in your own life that inspired you to take this path?
Well, thank you so much, Heman, for this invitation to speak with you today. And I'm really happy to share some insights from research and from my journey working with many minority groups over the last 2 decades or more. So you asked me where did that start from. So I would probably say my upbringing in Canada. So I'm from Canada originally, and I grew up in a part of Canada that was predominantly white settler colonial communities, but also with a lot of diversity. So I grew up in a small town where there were a lot of French speakers, so the Francophone community was there. There are many First Nations communities, so the Indigenous communities of Canada in my community as well, and many refugee and migrant groups as well. So from an early age, there was a lot of diversity in my classroom. There was a lot of diversity in what I was learning about in terms of the history of the formation of the modern Canadian state, also the experience of First Nations peoples that preceded that and the colonial practices that led to the formation of the Canadian state. So I think that appreciation and interest in cultural diversity was really formative for me as a starting point. And then when I got to university, I was interested in studying international relations, international politics. And I was really lucky that when I started at my university, they offered a new program called a theme school in international justice and human rights. And it was one of the first examples of undergraduate education in human rights anywhere in the world, actually. So it was good timing for me. Also at that time, which was the mid-1990s, we had major significant global interventions to protect minority groups and instances of genocide. So I'm thinking of the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the genocide there, and also the genocide in Rwanda. So when I was learning about international politics and international law on protecting human rights, but also minority rights, there's these two major global crises, along with many others, but those in particular that had implications for harms to ethnocultural groups, religious groups, etc. So I think those were some of the things that really encouraged me to continue in this direction. And maybe I'll just add one other, if I think of one person who inspired me towards work on caste-based discrimination, when I was at university, I used to run a radio show called Rights Talk with a good friend of mine. And we interviewed someone named Yogeshwar Harde. And he was an early leader in the Dalit movement in Canada. He was part of the diaspora movement. He was one of the first to go to the UN. And myself and my friend, we hosted some talks for him on campus. We interviewed him. So I learned very early in the mid-90s about the experience of and effects of caste-based discrimination. And that was quite formative for me as well.
Thank you very much for sharing your new insights with me that I was not that much familiar with that. And it is also fascinating that how personal experiences can shape such a profound commitment. Speaking of the grassroots movements, South Asia is a region with immense diversity, but it is also home to some of the most marginalized communities like Dalits, religious minorities, indigenous tribes, and more. From your global experience and exposure, how do you see the state of minority rights in South Asia compared to other regions? Are there any unique or diverse challenges here that you have observed, or what gives you hope for the change?
Thank you for that question. And I think for those interested in minority rights protection, South Asia is an extremely important region, principally because there is so much diversity, right, in terms of religious diversity, ethnocultural diversity, the presence of indigenous peoples or Adivasis in many countries in the region, and of course the existence of caste structures that run through that. And so it's a very complex picture from the point of view of identity politics. It's also a region that is, dealing with the legacies of colonialism and the impact of colonial borders on creating minority groups. The challenge of constructing nationhood and nation states in the face of such extraordinary diversity, I think, has been a challenge in not only in South Asia, but particularly there. And I think we've also unfortunately seen a lot of violence between communities, the violence inherent in caste structures, violence that's emerged from religious sectarian conflict, violence against indigenous communities who've had their land taken away. So it's also, unfortunately, a place where there's been a lot of persecution and oppression of minority groups as well. Also, I think what's distinct about South Asia is that you do not have a regional human rights system. At the moment, I think it's probably the last region in the world, sub-region, that doesn't have a distinct human rights system. Even in your neighbors, you have the ASEAN system, and you have the Arab League has a human rights treaty as well. So I think that's something that hopefully we would see in the future, that South Asia would develop its own understanding of human rights for the region. But the consequence of that is that you have fewer international mechanisms to appeal to for advocacy, for state accountability. So that is, I think, a weakness for the region. And I think that, there is, of course, a rich tradition of social movements in South Asia that, strong mobilization that's achieved extraordinary things. And that's an exciting diversity of civil society voices. Unfortunately, you also have shrinking space for civil society in many South Asian countries. So that's, a risk for protection of minority rights. If voices are suppressed, if funding is blocked, if people are, arrested and human rights defenders are threatened. So I think, unfortunately, we see those practices in South Asia as well that are impacting on the protection of minority rights in the region.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many severe challenges that is affecting South Asia. But focusing on one of the most persistent issue, which is caste-based discrimination, which is often seen as South Asian problem. But as you have worked with the Dalit Solidarity Network and global organization, how do you explain caste to someone who is not familiar with this term, and how do you think caste-based discrimination has not received the global attention as other forms of systematic operations like racism?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I certainly, the experience of caste discrimination is not unique to South Asia. It has migrated globally through migration, but there are also in many other parts of the world similar caste-like structures of oppression. And I think the movement has really been good at identifying that. And I'll say a bit more about that. I mean, in terms of how I personally would explain caste to people who aren't familiar with it, it's a system of hierarchy and oppression that people are born into and cannot escape from. And it has some resonance with structures of race in that both are socially constructed, right? They're fictions created by humans. But there's also some unique features, I would say, of caste-based discrimination, particularly around occupation, the concepts of pollution and purity, and this idea of inherited status of birth. So it's very difficult to escape those structural inequalities one is born into. And in terms of why has it not received global attention, I mean, most of my research has been more the latter part of the 20th century. And certainly in the mid to early part of the 20th century, you had some initial attempts by the great Ambedkar, for example, Dr. Ambedkar, to try to bring international attention to caste issues. He reached out to leaders of the African American movement to try to collaborate. But the thing that he faced at that same time was the big process of decolonization, India as a rising power in the non-aligned movement. So it was very difficult, I think, to get India to accept its own failings on the public stage when it was trying to assert its new independent identity, its leadership in key issues, including against racism, actually. So that in the early period of the 20th century is partly why we don't see that that much international attention. And then it's also has been, largely invisible to outside communities. We don't, in contrast to racism, where you have like a clear color line, you don't necessarily have that in the caste structure. So it can be hard for people to identify that from outside. And I think it's taken groups some time to build international cooperation, to move towards a global movement, because that international recognition comes from people advocating in many different countries about the oppression that comes with caste discrimination, the violence that comes with that. And there needs to be good cooperation across borders in order to ensure that there is sustained international support and interest in the issue. And I think that we saw that coming up really at the late 20th century, which I'm happy to say a few more words about. But that would be how I would explain why there hasn't been as much attention to it as, for example, as race on the international stage.
Is to say that caste is in the fabric of social in South Asia. I mean, if you're born with a caste identity in South Asia, no matter if you transition it from another religion, that is not going to change until you die. And it is also shocking that caste affects over 260 million people globally. If we talk about Africa and other parts of the world, and it is not that much widely understood yet. Also, the UN says over 1 billion people globally belongs to minorities and indigenous groups that are facing severe discrimination. But behind every statistics, there is a human story. When you co-founded the Dalit Solidarity Network, you called that caste is one of the oldest system of oppression. What was your, turning point at that time? Was there any phase, story, or movement that you thought I cannot walk away from fight of this kind of oppression?
So if you're talking about where does the Dalit Solidarity Network UK emerge from, I joined in 2011. I was aware of the Dalit Solidarity Network before that, and it was formally founded as a charity in 2003, but it was founded as an organization around 1998. And the initial leadership was from David Haslam, who was a British national, but a really important actor also in the anti-apartheid movement in the UK, part of that global movement. So I think he took inspiration from the anti-apartheid movement and the concept of solidarity that has been so important in ending apartheid in South Africa, and used that to elaborate a solidarity network for people affected by caste-based discrimination, in particular Dalits. And so DSN UK became effectively one of the first solidarity networks in the UK, or in Europe. We have seen that expand. So there are other countries in Europe that have Dalit solidarity networks. So places like Netherlands, Germany, Norway. And the initial work of the Dalit Solidarity Network was really focused on amplifying the voices of activists from South Asia to decision makers in the UK that could have some influence on their countries, whether that was through diplomacy or through development funding, or through business, right? Because many businesses have supply chains, and we know that caste discrimination can create harms for workers in those supply chains. So, so it started from that, but latterly, the network has focused more and more on the experiences of caste-based discrimination of people within the UK, because unfortunately, those practices have migrated to the UK. They do exist, but they're not very well prohibited in the law. And so there has been an extensive movement of activists in the UK to try and ensure that caste is a protected characteristic under the law, and that it's safeguarded against discrimination. And that's an ongoing battle that we have in the UK. We tried to bring issues of caste-based discrimination to the attention of actors within businesses, within higher education, within other labor sectors, to try and support people who are facing this discrimination that is not necessarily that well understood by the general public in the UK.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Even your organization, international organizations like these inspire us, the local organization, to drive a systematic change. Speaking of the change, you have extensively worked on civil society mobilization for human rights. In South Asia, we have seen movements like Dalit rights movement or fight for the indigenous land rights. But often these movements face severe pushback. From your experience, what are the key ingredients for successful civil society movement? I would like to quote one of the instances from your book that transactional social mobilization and minority rights. You discuss how Afro dissidents in Latin America and Dalits in South Asia have used a transactional network to amplify their voices. Would you like to share an example of a movement that successfully leveraged international support to create a change?
Yeah, so in the book, I tried to compare four groups who have taken the strategy of mobilizing across borders under a common identity frame to develop new norms, new rights, recognition of new rights in international law. And so I look at indigenous movement, indigenous peoples. I look at the Roma movement in Europe. I look at the Dalit movement and their allies, and I look at people of African descent, particularly in Latin America, where there's a distinct movement. And what I found for all of those groups that they had in common was, first of all, they came up with a common identity frame in which many different diverse identities could come together. So, for example, for Indigenous communities, obviously there are many different Indigenous communities, but they unite under the identity Indigenous peoples. And for the Dalit movement, a key innovation was uniting under the concept of discrimination on the basis of work and descent. So we moved beyond caste or a narrow understanding in only Hindu structures, let's say, to something much broader. And that brought in immediately, for example, the Barakumin community from Japan. It brought in many communities from Africa so that they could unite under a common identity and say, we face the same type of oppression. And now we're coming together to demand that our rights are recognized. And so they mobilized through transnational advocacy networks, which is just a way, a kind of coalition or a way that groups come together from different smaller organizations to unite and have a common agenda. And for all of the groups I looked at, they also are focused on developing new standards, new rights in international law, and elaborating those with their own voice, right? Rather than letting the oppressors tell them what their rights are, they elaborate for themselves what those rights are. And they go to spaces like the United Nations and say, we want to be recognized. These are the human rights violations we face, and these are the rights protections we feel should be recognized. And they do that in different ways. One of the things that they've done is make use of political opportunities at the UN. In the book, I particularly look at the importance of the 2001 World Conference Against Racism that was held in Durban, South Africa. And at that event, the global Dalit movement in particular was extremely visible and successful. They were involved from day one in preparing for that conference and getting recognition. In the end, they were not successful, actually, in getting the recognition of caste-based discrimination in the final agreement of that conference, because India objected. And India was able to use, the government of India at the time was able to use its power to persuade other states not to vote on that. So it's a place of contestation, right? It's a challenge, right? It's very political. But groups have been successful. And particularly we see people of African descent have been able to secure significant recognition at the UN to create new institutions, to monitor their rights. They're currently drafting a new declaration on the rights of people of African descent. So that shows what's possible. But I feel that the global movement of people discriminated on work and descent is entering a new era, if you will, of mobilization, really focused not only on UN human rights institutions, but looking at UN Sustainable Development Goals institutions, doing a lot of innovative work at the African Commission on Human Rights. So it's an exciting time at the international level for this transnational mobilization. Groups have learned over 20 years how to be effective in spaces like the UN, and I think that we're seeing that sustained advocacy at the international level is yielding some results.
Yeah, being a part of G4 communities discriminated on work and descent, I'm familiar with, how they provide the platform for the global solidarity, for network to the people who can drive a local change. I would like to talk about your role of international organization in this process. You have worked with the UN, UNDP, and other international bodies. While these international organizations have immense power, but they are often criticized for being ineffective on the ground. From your own experience, what's the real impact of these organizations in protecting minority rights? For instance, in your research on international order and diversity regimes and minority rights, you discuss how global instability affect minority rights. How can international organizations adapt to these changes?
Thank you for that question. The UN has been the focus of a lot of my research because I'm interested in international relations, and when the UN was formed in 1945, the attempts to recognize minority rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were foiled, right? So there was a proposal and it was rejected. But the UN General Assembly came together and said, look, we cannot ignore the fate of minorities. That was the title of their resolution on this. And they decided to invest in creating UN institutions that would look at issues affecting minorities. So the UN took that very seriously from the beginning. Quite quickly, the attention turned more to issues of racism. So we have a long period where other minority rights issues are largely sidelined at the UN. But eventually it comes out more in the early 1990s when we have a new UN Declaration on the Rights of Ethnic, Religious, Linguistic minorities. Just to go back to the UN as an institution, the UN is not that powerful in itself, right? The UN is an institution of member states, and it's member states that determine the agenda of the UN. So although it is very bureaucratic and there are lots of UN staff, they're effectively told what to do by the member states. So they can only be so progressive as those states are generally willing to be. But the UN can be a useful ally to minority groups, and it has been. And in fact, the current UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, who's the expert appointed by the UN to look at minority rights concerns, he has an open call right now inviting minorities to tell him how they've worked with the UN. So if anyone has a story to tell, positive or negative, I'm sure he'd like to hear it. But what the UN can do, importantly, it provides spaces for minority groups to advocate, to be heard on the international stage, and to speak to many states at once. One of the places they do that is in the UN Forum on Minority Issues, which meets for a couple of days each year in Geneva. And many minority groups go there, they raise concerns. If anyone's interested, we have created a website called minorityforum.info, where you can search any statements that have been made at that platform. So any statements on any minority group, you can search and find that. So we can see that there are spaces in the UN where minorities can raise issues of concern. And there are also allies in terms of monitoring bodies. So groups, the independent experts who monitor state compliance with treaties. They look at what states say they're doing to protect minorities. They criticize that and they give recommendations about how they can do better. So that's really important. And then many UN agencies do work with communities in country. It's important to remember that the two major UN declarations on minorities and on indigenous peoples have specific articles within those declarations that require UN agencies to help implement those rights. So there is an obligation on the part of those agencies to do something and to cooperate with minorities. And some do it better than others, but it's also important for civil society to approach those UN institutions and say, these are the types of support that we would find helpful. And certainly on Caste, there have been some important examples of UN institutions being a positive voice for challenging practices of caste-based discrimination, even when countries, for example, like India, have blocked certain progress at the UN on that. So we can see parts of the UN as allies for minorities.
And that's such an important point, Dr. Lennox, that adapting to the global instability is crucial for these organizations to remain effective. But let's shift a gear a bit and talk about the education. You have been deeply involved in it. You have also co-designed human rights educational programs, including MA in education rights by distance learning. Why do you believe that education is such a powerful tool in the fight for human rights? Also, I have seen in your paper that you mentioned that protecting academic freedom in distance learning education. How can you make human rights education more accessible to marginalized communities in South Asia?
Thank you. I think human rights education is absolutely vital because people have a right to know what their rights are. And human rights education also gives people skills and strategies to try and defend those rights. And that has been at the center of the human rights education that we tried to lead here at the University of London. But I think that, we've got to find ways to localize human rights education so that you can teach about what's happening at the international level and international treaties. And that's very important to understand what that law is. But you also have to do what anthropologist Sally Mary calls vernacularization. So she talks about how local activists translate international standards, international norms around human rights into local understandings and meetings and contexts. And that's a very important process to ensure that local communities can grasp those human rights and defend them in a way that they think is appropriate. And I think we've seen in many cases that marginalized communities play a significant role in developing human rights standards. I think especially indigenous peoples have been very successful at that, at mobilizing at the grassroots level, coming to the UN, collaborating over many, many decades to secure recognition of their rights. And I would say also that Human rights education can take many forms. We're doing digital distance learning education here at the University of London at the moment. And I think it can make it more accessible to a certain extent. But we have to also look at different pedagogical approaches of working with local communities. So the way I teach human rights in a master's degree program is different from how I would teach it if I was visiting a village community organization, right? So we have to adapt that. But we also have to ask, importantly, what do people want to learn about in terms of human rights, right? That's my responsibility as a teacher, to understand what people want to know. It's my responsibility to find ways to communicate that so that they can feel empowered and knowledgeable. And that we can ensure also that groups within communities who may be marginalized have an opportunity to access human rights education as well. So that's part of taking a human rights approach to human rights education. How do people participate in developing the curriculum that's of interest to them? How do we recognize discrimination within communities and ensure marginalized groups within communities have access to that education? So I think it's important to remember human rights practice in our delivery of human rights education as well.
Since we come to the end of our podcast, I would like to ask you, our audience is many of whom are emerging activists and community leaders. What practical, as a teacher, as a co-designer of the human rights program, what practical advice would you offer as they navigate the complexities of human rights work? How they can stay resilient and effective in a world that often silences marginalized voices?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging time for those working on marginalized groups, right? We have significant rise of global populism, which is not a friend of minority rights, generally speaking. We have rising threats in terms of climate change and AI and, many different areas of rights, and a changing world order as well, right? So countries that maybe would have previously championed minority rights, we can't rely on them to do that anymore. And countries that have oppressed minorities are becoming more powerful. So it is a challenging time. I think it's really essential that we build new alliances between marginalized groups, because if we're a lone voice, then it's very hard to seek recognition, to sustain advocacy. But the more people work together and cooperate and collaborate, the stronger they are. The other thing is to try and keep documenting the experiences of marginalized groups, right? To show what is the experience of inequality, to document cases of violence, to speak truth to power, as they say. And information is power for civil society movements. So it's important to keep doing that research about what is happening in people's communities and ensure that people's voices are heard. And it's also, to end maybe on the point about education, it's important to educate people about what their rights are, because that is the first step in fighting back and understanding that, oppression and violence is not the natural order of things. It's what dominant groups do to oppressed groups. And if they have a sense that that is unlawful, that they have rights, that they have a voice for those rights, then I think that's the first step in giving them confidence to mobilize against the oppression that they face. So I think there's an important role for human rights education in ensuring that minority rights are protected.
Yeah, Dr. Lennox, I also totally agree with you on that. Like documenting the cases of minority rights and incidents is really important. Along with that, being aware of our basic rights is also important. With that, thank you very much for sharing your incredible insights and experience with us today. Your work is a testament of the power of perseverance and the belief that change is possible even in the face of immense challenges, whether it is AI or any other thing. For audience, I hope this conversation has sparked a deeper understanding of the struggles and troubles of the marginalized communities like Dalits, Adivasis, or minority communities in any part of the world. Thank you, Dr. Lennox, for being a such inspiring guest. And thank you to our listeners for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with others who might find it meaningful. Until next time, this is Heman signing off. Stay curious, passionate, and keep fighting for what's your right. Is rightfully said by Dr. Lennox that know you are right.
Thank you.
Thank you.